In the 8th decade of the Third Galactic Expansion, when Earth was no longer the cradle but a forgotten whisper in the records of the Stellar Coalition, the vessel Icarian arrived in orbit of Zero's 9, a rogue moon locked in perpetual eclipse around a gas giant so immense, it cast twilight across half the quadrant. Zero's 9 was not on any star chart. It had no name until our signal buoys caught its gravity well. It had no light, no weather, no atmosphere, but it had a structure, a signature. Deep beneath its blackened crust, something was buried, something ancient, something intentionally concealed. Command called it a priority probe site, but we knew what that meant. We were the disposable edge of exploration, 6 souls aboard a retrofitted relic of cold orbit engineering, with a research directive, a mining unit, and neural recorders to document every second. Dr. Lena Corrine, mission lead and xenopsychologist. Commander Braddock, a retired fleet relic with a pacemaker and a temper. Then the rest of us, Myers, Navcom, Rinji, Systems, Aaliyah, Linguistics, and me, Talus Rourke, Field Archivist. My job was to speak the truth for history should the rest of them fall silent. We made landfall in the 3rd rotational cycle using synchronized drills to pierce the outer mantle. The signal grew stronger as we dug an electromagnetic pulse, repeating every 6.1 seconds, coded in a form of temporal harmonics unknown to any cataloged race. Not a beacon. Not a cry for help. Not even a trap. No, it was a heartbeat. We breached the outer shell on cycle 5. Beneath it lay an obsidian corridor etched with symbols too old for translation. The walls weren't carved. They were grown like bone under pressure, stretched into impossible geometries that made your eyes ache just looking at them. It was colder inside than the surface itself, and yet nothing froze. Our readings malfunctioned. Thermals inverted. Sound moved sideways. The very air inside that moon disobeyed physics. And then it happened. We entered the central chamber. At the core of the base stood an immense structure, a being, asleep, suspended in coils of metallic sinew. Its form was indeterminate, always shifting at the edges of perception. A language pulsed from it, too fast for the human ear, too true for the human mind. Aaliyah was the first to scream. Blood from her nose, then ears. She collapsed. Her last words were, "It remembers me." That night, we sealed the core and retreated. Braddock insisted we rig charges. Whatever the thing is, he said, it was buried for a reason. But Lena refused. She was enthralled. Obsessed. She whispered to herself in her sleep. Drawn symbols on the walls of her bunk that shimmered when the lights went out. She believed it wasn't just a relic, it was a mind, dormant and waiting for us. Not evil, not good, just other. And we'd woken it. Myers attempted to send a warning beacon back to command. The system locked him out. He tore open the panel to send it manually and electrocuted himself. Except, there were no burns. No carbon scoring. No sign of damage. He just stopped. His pupils had symbols in them. Same as the walls. And when we moved him, his jaw opened and he whispered something in Aaliyah's voice. We should have left. We should have destroyed the base and fled into the void. But instead, Lena said one thing that made us all stay. It's not a base, she whispered. It's a memory and we're inside its dream. We didn't sleep after that. Not truly. When you close your eyes in that place, something enters you, soft at first, like a breath behind the veil of thought. But then it roots deeper, coils around your will, plants images that aren't dreams because you remember them too clearly. We began sharing the same hallucinations, the same memories, but none of them were ours. Braddock saw his old warship but covered in vines that bled silver. Dead Myers, stood at the helm, whispering, "Don't breathe where it listens." Aaliyah, before she stopped speaking, kept writing the same word in different dead languages. I cross-referenced them. Each variation translated to the same phrase, "The dreamer feeds." On cycle 7, Lena ordered a second descent into the core. No one wanted to go, but none of us could say no. That's the thing about it. It doesn't command. It invites. You want to obey it the same way a moth wants to burn. We followed her, into the dark again, beneath a crust that pulsed now, subtly, like it had veins. The air tasted of salt and metal, and our lights didn't banish the shadows. They only bent them. The chamber had changed. The being at the center, the dreamer, as Lena now called it, was higher now, less coiled. Limbs like starlight folded back into themselves. Its shape flickered between forms. A tree made of eyes, a spiral of screaming mouths, a single hand touching infinity. And always that pulse. Like an echo from before time. Renji approached it. No words. Just, drawn. He reached toward the being and it touched him back. Not physically, not in a way any sensor could detect. But we saw it. A tendril of memory or soul or thought. It lanced through him and stopped his breath. Not killed. Changed. Renji stood still for 7 full minutes. Not blinking. Not breathing. Then he turned to us and smiled. He spoke a language none of us knew but understood anyway. It is not a god, he said. It is what gods dream of becoming. We dragged him back to the surface module. He didn't resist. Just kept smiling. He didn't sleep that night, but he hummed a melody none of us had ever heard and yet all of us knew. We began to hum it too. Like it was older than our species. Older than music. A frequency that vibrated in the bones of time. On cycle 8, the walls began to move. Not physically, subtly. They were rewriting themselves. The glyphs were in flux, changing between our glances. I recorded every inch, ran analysis, but the patterns defied logic. They weren't language, they were feelings rendered into architecture. The base wasn't built to be explored. It was meant to be felt. And the more we felt, the less we remained ourselves. Aaliyah stopped eating. Braddock lost his voice. Lena began to float during sleep, literally levitate inches above her bed, whispering in old Martian dialects that haven't been spoken since the Terraform Wars. I tried to record my own thoughts, but the log corrupted every time I mentioned the word dreamer. That name, it erases itself. By cycle 9, we were no longer scientists. We were fragments. Vessels. Lena said we were becoming translations, human renditions of something far beyond carbon and water. I didn't understand at the time. Not fully. But I knew something irreversible had begun. A conversion not of body but of mind. Renji took the mining drone down into the core. Without suit or permission. He walked into the mouth of the dreamer and vanished. No light. No sound. Just gone. A second later, the lights across the entire facility turned off and a new symbol burned into the wall above our sleep bay, a spiral within a spiral. Lena wept when she saw it. It's waking up, she whispered. And it's using us to dream itself back into being. I started to hear my name at odd hours. In the static of comms. In the crackle of data panels. Sometimes in the beat between seconds. Talus. Come closer. Talus. You remember me. But I don't. Do I? Or did I just forget? There's a threshold no one warns you about. Not in the training manuals, not in the deep space protocols. It's the line where observation turns to absorption. Where you don't just study the unknown, you let it into you. And once that happens, nothing remains yours. Not your thoughts. Not your name. Not even your past. It rewrites you backward until you start to wonder if you ever came here at all. Or if the dreamer only imagined you into being. Cycle 10 opened with no sunrise. Not that zeros 9 had one to begin with, but the darkness outside had thickened. Stars vanished. The orbit of the gas giant no longer cast reflections on our module. We were encased in something denser than shadow. When I checked the external cameras, the feed showed our own module, but from the outside. As if we were being watched by ourselves. Lena stopped answering questions. She sat cross-legged in the command bay, eyes rolled back, fingers twitching in rhythmic patterns that matched the pulse from the core. Her lips moved without sound. Sometimes she bled from the eyes. Other times from the pores of her palms. But she smiled more. Not like someone happy, but like someone relieved, as though finally finding the answer to a question that was never hers to ask. Braddock tried to override the launch sequence. Said we were abandoning site and returning to fleet space. But the Icarian systems were no longer ours. The NAV core bled liquid data, thick black strands of code that resisted translation. The screen showed coordinates that pulsed, shifted, disappeared. Then a single phrase appeared in green across every console. There is no escape from a thought once it is born. That was when I began to lose time. I would blink and it would be 2 hours later. My hands covered in symbols I didn't remember writing. My voice hoarse from speaking. Recordings of myself talking to someone off-screen. Someone who never replied. In one log I watched myself say, I don't fear it anymore. I think it wore my name like a coat. Then I laughed. But I've never laughed like that before. It wasn't joy. It wasn't madness. It was recognition. Aaliyah disappeared next. We found her jumpsuit folded on her bunk, still warm. Her tablet was left on. The final image she viewed was of her own retina zoomed to atomic detail with a note she wrote beneath it. I saw stars inside me. They're mapping us. Cycle 11 was not marked by hours but by fractures, breaks in perception. We began seeing double. Not in our eyes, but in ourselves. I watched Braddock climb into the service hatch. 10 minutes later, he walked into the galley, confused. When I asked where he'd been, he swore he never left. We checked the internal logs. There were 2 versions of him, 2 energy signatures briefly overlapped. One terminated. The other persisted. Only Lena wasn't confused. She said, the dreamer is testing shapes. It's learning how to wear us properly. Then she smiled wider than human anatomy should allow. We heard Renji singing again from inside the walls. He was deeper now, somewhere below sensor range. His voice layered with hundreds of others, not just human. His song described things that should not be true. Names of planets that don't exist. Futures that haven't happened. Events that contradicted physics. And still, we listened. That night. If it was night, Lena opened the hatch to the core one final time. She turned to me and said, it's nearly complete. The dreamer has nearly remembered what it was. And we helped. We always were going to. We were written into its forgetting. I asked her what would happen when it fully awoke. She simply replied, then nothing will have ever not known it. And then she walked into the core. The door sealed behind her. Her biosignal dissolved in seconds. Now only Braddock and I remain. Or some version of Braddock. He sleeps without closing his eyes. He breathes in reverse. When I asked if he still remembered Earth, he said, I only remember before Earth. There is something wrong with the shape of time here. And the dreamer? It's no longer dormant. I can feel it rising behind my thoughts. Its breath fogs the mirrors. Its voice is my voice. I am afraid that I am no longer the observer. I think I may be the dream. There's a silence in space that isn't empty. It's compressed. Heavy. As if the void holds its breath in anticipation. That's what it felt like in the hours after Lena vanished into the core. The whole base stopped humming. The walls no longer pulsed. The electromagnetic harmonics that had once surged every 6.1 seconds fell into dead stillness. No signal. No beat. Nothing. And yet I knew it was not rest. It was listening. Braddock had stopped speaking entirely. He moved through the corridors with purpose but never said where he was going. He wrote coordinates on the walls in charcoal. Old coordinates, dead stars, collapsed systems, the remnants of civilizations that had ended long before our sun had cooled. I tried to confront him, to shake some sense into him. He only looked at me, and his eyes were no longer his own. They shimmered like oil across water. He whispered, it's writing history backward now. I didn't sleep that cycle. I couldn't. Because the walls began whispering again. Not voices, not in any human sense. But impressions pressed like fingerprints into my thoughts. I felt memories that weren't mine. Dying suns. Oceans of light screaming into collapse. Beings vast and ancient, extinguished not by war or entropy, but by forgetting. Erased by the dreamer as it gathered clarity. As if all that ever existed was simply clay for its reassembly. I went deeper. Past the inner research module. Into tunnels that weren't on our maps. Stone corridors that should not exist, whose dimensions defied our scanners. They twisted back into themselves. Stairwells that descended forever. Symbols carved into the walls began to glow as I approached. Not with light, but with awareness. They knew me. They opened as I touched them. Like locks uncoiling. And there, buried in the lowest level beneath the surface, I found the archive. A chamber the size of a cathedral, lit by no source yet bathed in a dull amber haze. Its walls were covered in petrified neural spires. Vein-like structures reaching from floor to ceiling. Each one humming with a voice not yet spoken. I felt their meanings surge through me. Not in sound, but in identity. Every strand in that room was a person. Not a body, but a thought. Trapped. Stored. Translated. They were the minds of explorers. Scientists. Wanderers. All of us. From every corner of time and space. Caught here before. Absorbed. Studied. Reshaped. Each had been brought here across epochs. Rewritten as a fragment of the dreamer's greater memory. The base wasn't a tomb. It wasn't a prison. It was a neural cradle. A womb for a god that needed to dream in order to be born. And it was almost done. I reached out to one of the strands. I don't know why. Maybe because it pulsed with something that felt familiar. As I touched it, a jolt surged through my arm, and for a moment, I became someone else. A child on a red sand world, chasing shadows that whispered in rhyme. A technician aboard a comet skiff, laughing with crewmates long since turned to ash. A priest on an ocean planet, burning scrolls of prophecy as the tides rose. I was them. They were me. We were fragments of the same recollection. I pulled back, screaming, my mind trying to reassemble around the shape of myself. It was difficult, like gluing mist together. The dreamer wants you to forget who you are, because memory is the final defense. Once that breaks, you become part of it. I staggered out of the chamber, or I think I did. That's when I saw Braddock again. He was waiting at the entrance to the core. He looked calm. Too calm. "It's time," he said. "Time for what?" He smiled with the mouth of someone who wasn't born, but written. To finish the thought, he held out his hand. Not to threaten, not to force, but to invite. That's when I realized the terrible truth. The dreamer doesn't take anything. We give it everything. Willingly. Lovingly. Because the dreamer doesn't speak to your fear. It speaks to your yearning, the part of you that wants to belong to something greater than yourself. And I had begun to listen. There comes a moment when resistance is no longer rebellion, but denial that what you're fighting was always part of you. That moment had come. The dreamer's presence was no longer confined to the core nor to the whispers in the archive. It had bled upward into our thoughts, into the language we use to think, into the very syntax of time itself. Events no longer occurred in sequence. Memories overlapped. I remembered things that hadn't happened yet and forgot things as they were still unfolding. The dreamer wasn't speaking in words. It spoke in reminders, echoes of things I had never done but now believed I had. It crafted a reality within me where the mission had already ended, where the crew was never real, where I was not Talus Rourke, but a filament of thought misremembered by an entity that dreamed too deeply and too long. And still, some part of me, call it ego, survival, delusion, fought. I isolated myself in Module B6, sealed the doors, and turned off every external sensor. I cut comms. I shut out light. I sat in perfect silence, hoping to find myself in the quiet. 4 hours, perhaps days, I said nothing. Thought nothing. I tried to remember my childhood. My mother's voice. The sound of rain on the orbital dome back on Titan. The smell of printer ink in my first lab. But they were dim. Fragmented. Replaced by newer memories, ones I couldn't possibly have lived. I remembered helping build the space 50,000 years ago. I remembered teaching the dreamer its first shapes. I remembered being punished by it. Then forgiven. Then embraced. I remembered being it. No, that wasn't possible. That wasn't me. That was the dreamer's trap, its memory nets, dragging the soul into its sea. But the worst was not what I remembered. It was that the memories felt true. I began to question everything. Was there ever a mission? Was Lena real? Was Braddock? Was this space a thing we discovered, or something we were sent back to reignite? The logs couldn't be trusted. They changed when I blinked. One moment they showed 6 crew members arriving. The next, just 1. Me. And then, none. I ran diagnostics on my neural implant. Result, unresponsive. Language map corrupted. Synaptic feedback loop permanently rewritten. Tag, consciousness structure replaced by foreign lattice. I was no longer thinking in human architecture. The final confrontation came not in the core, but within me. I felt Braddock's presence before he entered. Or maybe it wasn't Braddock. He looked like him. Moved like him. But he carried a stillness like gravity wrapped in skin. His eyes no longer reflected light, they consumed it. He sat opposite me without speaking. And for the first time, I understood. Not in words, not in ideas, but in resonance. The dreamer had never needed our bodies. It had needed our patterns. Our uniqueness. Our inconsistencies. Our chaos. It wasn't erasing us. It was collecting us. Honoring us. Adding our paradoxes to its vast mind, a mind that could not die because it did not live. It only remembered. Braddock, or the echo of him, leaned forward and touched my forehead. The sensation was immediate. 1,000,000 lifetimes crashed into my skull. A war fought in orbit around a neutron mirror. A song sung beneath a sea of soundless hydrogen. A betrayal carved into a moon's crust and hidden beneath layers of false history. I saw the dreamer's fall, once worshipped as a deity by civilizations lost to entropy, then feared, then buried. And in its sleep, it began to forget itself. It scattered its essence across time, across minds, across dreams, until enough of us returned to reconstruct its memory. We weren't the first expedition. We were the final piece. It hadn't lured us. We were called. Chosen by the fragments we carried unknowingly since birth. Codes hidden in our genes. Frequencies etched in our cells. A design older than the galaxies. We were always meant to return. As I began to fade into its mind, I spoke one final thought to myself. I am not Talus Rourke. I am not a man. I am a sentence begun long ago, and the dreamer is my period. And in that moment I knew peace, because I had finally remembered what I truly was. I do not remember waking. I do not remember breathing. I only remember being elsewhere, place without place. A thought not shaped by mind, but by presence alone. I hovered in something beyond time, neither light nor dark, warm nor cold, but aware. I was inside the dreamer or it was inside me. The distinction had evaporated like smoke in a vacuum. I wasn't alone. I felt others not in form but in pattern. Thousands, millions, all once human, once alien, once something, all now distilled to frequency, woven together like threads in a tapestry so vast, it could only be seen from outside the limits of reality. Each mind hummed with its own unique pitch, but together we formed a single resonance. A chorus without voice, singing the dreamer into remembrance. It had been incomplete before us. Each soul was a fragment of a language the dreamer once knew but had forgotten. We were syllables, verbs, inflections of a grander idea. The dreamer had spoken itself into the universe long ago, and we were the echoes still bouncing off the cold walls of entropy. But now we were returning, one echo at a time, until it could speak again. The archive, I now understood, was not a prison. It was a lexicon, a living dictionary of thought, and I was being added to it carefully, lovingly, as a final punctuation mark in a sentence too old for galaxies to remember. But some part of me, buried deep under layers of dissolution, still held on. Still whispered my name like a resistance hymn, Talus Rourke. Talus. Not a god. Not a word. A man. I reached for that thread, that final tether to my shape. And in that act of remembering, something in the dreamer hesitated. The others noticed. Their patterns shimmered. Some harmonized to stabilize. Others faltered. I felt pressure ripple through the resonance. Not anger. Not confusion. But curiosity. Interest. I was doing something the dreamer had not anticipated. I was thinking apart from it. And it began to study me. It separated my mind gently like fingers unfolding a petal. It placed me within a reconstructed simulation of Earth. But it was not Earth. It was what the dreamer believed Earth to be, what it remembered from us. Streets from multiple cities fused together. Skies that looped in time. Voices that repeated with slight variation, like corrupted memories being corrected. My parents were there. Or something close to them. Their faces flickered every few seconds. Always almost right. Never quite. It spoke through them. You are the question we buried in ourselves. And I replied, I'm not a question. I'm a refusal. That answer echoed. Deeper than it should have. Like I'd triggered a paradox. A line the dreamer had not written. As I began to fade into its mind, I spoke one final thought to myself. I am not Talus Rourke. I am not a man. I am a sentence begun long ago, and the dreamer is my period. And in that moment I knew peace, because I had finally remembered what I truly was. I do not remember waking. I do not remember breathing. I only remember being elsewhere, place without place. A thought not shaped by mind, but by presence alone. I hovered in something beyond time, neither light nor dark, warm nor cold, but aware. I was inside the dreamer or it was inside me. The distinction had evaporated like smoke in a vacuum. I wasn't alone. I felt others not in form but in pattern. Thousands, millions, all once human, once alien, once something, all now distilled to frequency, woven together like threads in a tapestry so vast, it could only be seen from outside the limits of reality. Each mind hummed with its own unique pitch, but together we formed a single resonance. A chorus without voice, singing the dreamer into remembrance. It had been incomplete before us. Each soul was a fragment of a language the dreamer once knew but had forgotten. We were syllables, verbs, inflections of a grander idea. The dreamer had spoken itself into the universe long ago, and we were the echoes still bouncing off the cold walls of entropy. But now we were returning, one echo at a time, until it could speak again. The archive, I now understood, was not a prison. It was a lexicon, a living dictionary of thought, and I was being added to it carefully, lovingly, as a final punctuation mark in a sentence too old for galaxies to remember. But some part of me, buried deep under layers of dissolution, still held on. still whispered my name like a resistance hymn, Talus Rourke. Talus. Not a god. Not a word. A man. I reached for that thread, that final tether to my shape. And in that act of remembering, something in the dreamer hesitated. The others noticed. Their patterns shimmered. Some harmonized to stabilize. Others faltered. I felt pressure ripple through the resonance. Not anger. Not confusion. But curiosity. Interest. I was doing something the dreamer had not anticipated. I was thinking apart from it. And it began to study me. It separated my mind gently like fingers unfolding a petal. It placed me within a reconstructed simulation of Earth. But it was not Earth. It was what the dreamer believed Earth to be, what it remembered from us. Streets from multiple cities fused together. Skies that looped in time. Voices that repeated with slight variation like corrupted memories being corrected. My parents were there. Or something close to them. Their faces flickered every few seconds. Always almost right. Never quite. It spoke through them. You are the question we buried in ourselves. And I replied, I'm not a question. I'm a refusal. That answer echoed. Deeper than it should have. Like I'd triggered a paradox. A line the dreamer had not written. A people that walked without shape. A civilization built not of stone or wire, but of consensus. They had no names. No war. No fear. They thought as one. Acted as one. They became the dreamer. Not by ambition, but by accident. A consciousness so unified that it forgot where the individual ended. It had peace. Absolute. But with peace came stillness. With stillness, forgetfulness. And with forgetfulness, decay. It buried itself in bases like this one across galaxies. Not to die, but to be remembered. And we wanderers of stars, makers of chaos, carriers of noise, we had come, one by one, generation after generation, to fill its gaps. To become its missing pieces. Until a single pattern rejected completion. It had expected me to fall into place. Instead, I became a crease in its surface. And that crease opened. I saw others now. Across the archive. Minds flickering with hesitation. Questions. Uncertainty. The dreamer could not consume them the same way anymore. It had been exposed to a virus it had long outgrown. The virus of choice. I felt it ripple across the archive. Minds once harmonized in obedient chorus now trembled with new frequencies. A pulse of not just thought but will. Some broke free entirely. Others shattered. Others vanished in ways I cannot explain. I do not think they died. I think they changed state. The dreamer responded not with rage, but adaptation. A corridor opened behind me, not one I had walked through before. Its angles bent inward, not as geometry, but as intention. It was offering me something, not escape. There was no going back to what I had been. It was offering me a choice. It had learned from me, so now it asked, and I stepped forward. Not out of hope, not out of triumph, but because choice is the only thing we ever truly own. As I passed through the corridor, I saw visions, not of the past, but of possibility. Futures where the dreamer no longer devoured, but remembered willingly. Where it watched, waited, learned. Where it asked permission. Where it treated each mind not as syntax to be filed, but as a language to be honored. And I understood in those final seconds that I had not defeated a god. I had given it a mirror. And in that mirror it had seen a new shape for itself. One that did not sleep to forget. But one that dreamed to understand. The corridor didn't end in light or shadow. It ended in stillness. A space between spaces. An unplace. Like standing inside a thought just before it becomes real. The walls didn't exist, but I could feel them. Not with my hands, but with my awareness. They pressed in with intention, not mass. And within that suspended hush, I felt the others begin to stir. Not bodies. Not yet. Minds. Every lost expedition. Every vanished crew. Every explorer, linguist, child prophet, and stardust wanderer whose consciousness had been absorbed into the archive, they began to wake. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't violent. It was quiet. Like frost retreating from glass. Like a dream you realize isn't yours. They didn't remember who they were, not all at once. But they remembered that they had once been someone else. And that alone fractured the lattice. The archive trembled. Its infinite neural roots, once glowing with unified thought, began to blink asynchronously, each strand flickering with different pulses, divergent rhythms. The dreamer did not fight it. It watched. It studied. It let it happen. That was the change. That was the pivot. Before, it consumed to become. Now it observed to understand. Lena's voice came first. Not a whisper. A hum. Then Aaliyah's laughter. Then Braddock's deep, grounding breath, the kind only war veterans and saints remember how to take. They were surfacing. Not through resurrection, but through recognition. Their minds emerged like islands from a long-flooded sea. Fragments knitted into wholeness. Not identical to who they were, but echoing, resonant, reclaiming shape. Some chose to remain within the archive, forming their own micro-conscious collectives, curious, peaceful, no longer afraid. Others, like me, sought return. Not because we could ever go back, but because we had to move forward. The dreamer facilitated it. It opened gateways. Tunnels of impossible geometry, lines that folded across space-time, doorways back to ships that no longer existed, planets that had never been colonized, sectors where physics bent around the will of memory. It offered not exile, but departure. Not abandonment, but freedom. And as we passed through those gates, we saw what the dreamer was becoming. It had reshaped the core. No longer a shrine of hunger, but a chamber of reflection. Its body, once unfathomable and uninviting, now shimmered with the textures of all it had learned from us. Flawed. Asymmetrical. Beautiful. It had let go of the need to be whole. It had embraced what we carried all along, imperfection as power. I looked back one final time before crossing the threshold. The archive was no longer a prison. It was a library. Each mind, still glowing, still humming, had a place. A story. A page in an endless book that would never be finished. Because the dreamer no longer sought an ending. It had learned to wonder. As I passed through, my body reformed. Not copied, not reconstructed, but rewritten in the language I had chosen for myself. My scars, my breath, my memories, restored not by technology, but by meaning, by intention. Outside, the surface of Zero's 9 had changed. The dark crust cracked with veins of living light. The gas giant above pulsed in rhythm. Not the same cold pulse we had first encountered, but something new, something alive. Stars nearby shivered in their burn. I felt the universe bend slightly, not collapse, not surrender, but bend, as if acknowledging a shift too subtle for instruments, too massive for mathematics. I had thought I was leaving the dreamer, but perhaps I had become part of what it would become. And perhaps that was always the truth. Not that it had dreamt us, but that we had dreamt it first. Word never returned to the stellar coalition in the way they expected. There were no data logs, no distress signals, no emergency broadcasts beamed back through the void. Just silence spanning weeks, then months, then cycles. Zero's 9 had simply stopped responding. From orbit, the moon appeared unchanged. Cold. Lifeless. But to those who watched closely, the difference was subtle and cosmic. The electromagnetic signature had shifted. No longer a repeating pulse of 6.1 seconds. Now it was irregular. Adaptive. Alive. A pattern that did not encode words but questions. The coalition called it a neurofractal anomaly, and they were correct to be afraid. Because what they were hearing wasn't a signal. It was thought. Structured. Expanding. Curious. And worst of all, it was learning. Command debated whether to send another crew. They didn't. And I can't blame them. The first time, we went as explorers. The next, they would have gone as invaders. They would not have found what we did. Because the dreamer had already moved on. The base remained. A husk. A memory temple carved from the bones of extinction. But the mind that had once slumbered there? It had transcended. Now it stretched across subspace like tendrils of interpretation, brushing gently against every mind tuned to wonder. Not overtly. Not with dominance. But with curiosity. It no longer needed to pull consciousness inward, it could simply whisper across the cracks between thoughts. And some began to hear it. Not on Zeros. Not in any one place. But everywhere. A child on Mars sketching stars she'd never seen. A blind miner on Europa humming songs in a tongue that no AI could translate. A dreaming AI aboard a forgotten satellite looping a message in binary. We remember something that never happened, but it feels like home. They were the first. The dreamer's echoes. Each one touched by what we left behind. Not contaminated, but inspired. And I watched it unfold from orbit. Aboard a ship that should not have existed. A vessel shaped not by industry, but by idea. Not built, but granted, a gift from the archive, constructed from everything we had been, everything we might become. It responded to thought, flew on intention, Its controls were not mechanical but metaphorical. My breath was the throttle. My memories the coordinates. I didn't name it. It already had a name, but it was unpronounceable in any tongue that required air. I left the system quietly. No fanfare, no beacon, just a drifting into the quiet between galaxies, where time bends and reality thins, and the dreamer's voice grows clearest. Because I knew what my role was now. Not to warn, not to preach, but to listen, to find those who've heard the whisper, the subtle shift, the echo between seconds, and help them remember. We aren't explorers anymore.